Hello, my name is Donald Best. I'm doing this video on my journey through mental health and physical and learning disabilities. Um, to go back to my first years of school, which were both kindergarten, it was clear that something was wrong, but I remember my mom telling me that I was just delayed in my development, and I think she really believed that. I don't think she really had any idea that I just was a little slow and needed to catch up, and certainly had no idea that there was a difference in my potential in life from what would be expected from a normal, healthy person. In fact, if anything, she was still really convinced that I had great potential, that she had given birth to a genius. However, by the end of my second year in kindergarten, it was clear that my development was not catching up. I had not closed the gap with my peers at all. In fact, if anything, it was wider. So, before I started first grade, I was taken to the state capitol and given a full battery of assessment, including IQ tests and all kinds of neurological tests, and by a whole team of professionals. And I remember how upset my mother was at the results, because the results were far different than what she had expected, I think. I think she just thought she would learn, well, what the problem was, and be given some kind of idea on just how to sort it out. What the problem was brain damage. Years later, I got an MRI, and it shows a scar going on my brain, going from about here to here. If you know about brain anatomy, it's going from the occipital lobe into the temporal lobe. And, that's just what's visible on an MRI after 20 years or more. I was probably closer to 25, 26 years, if I remember how old I was at the time. Anyway, my brain damage had knocked out my visual memory and had left me with very poor motor skills. And what they said about my motor skills was pretty interesting. They could divide them up into 3 different categories, and that is my ability to use my large muscles over large distances accurately, and that was low normal. So rather than being gifted physically in the very skills you need to walk and do your large movements, I was actually clearly not that great, but I wasn't outside of the normal range. So that didn't explain my being an early walker at all. Also, my ability to move my small muscles accurately, what it takes to type and stuff, that was also low normal. However, when they measured my ability to use my large muscles and move them small distances accurately, All you had to do was have me hold out my hand and watch it shake to see the problem there. And they probably came to my diagnosis really quickly once they saw that. And it's interesting that no one else had seen it before. It was visible, it was clear, but everybody else had blinders on. And I think maybe my kindergarten teacher saw it, but my mother didn't saw it for the first time when they showed it to her. And what that diagnosis was borderline cerebral palsy. My ability to move my large muscles small distances accurately was that of an 18-month-old by the time I was almost 7. So what do you have to do? Well, any kind of sports activity requires great accuracy with your large muscles. Your ability to catch balls, aim and throw balls, swing bats, and hit a ball, all of that stuff, very important. And but I don't think I would have ever been a great athlete in any case. What the real punch is writing. People don't write like this. People write using their large pectoral muscles and their arm muscles. They don't use the tiny muscles of the forearm and the fine movements of the hand. And so that was why you might as well expect an 18-month-old to write as me. And given that I didn't have a visual memory, now what does that mean? What does it mean that I don't have a visual memory? Well, your memory can be divided up into recognition and recall. So when you see something and are able to identify it, that's a chair, that's a lamp, this is Aunt Frederick. Whatever it is you're identifying, that's recognition. Recall is being able to basically basically a photograph you took at the time, so you remember what it looks like by picturing it in your mind, and you're not imagining what it looked like. You're picturing it based on just a record of what your visual neurons were doing. And if you're extremely good at that, well, you could say you have a photographic memory. But everybody has some photographic quality to their memory, and that's why they can recall what things look like, and I cannot. I cannot sit and think, can't recall what my mother looks like. I don't recall what I look like. I can recognize them both, but I can't do that very well. I'm often accused of being rude for not recognizing people out of context at school or at church or at work. You're the only one who looks remotely like you, but I see you in the, everybody looks familiar, like somebody I know in the supermarket. So I see somebody in the supermarket I know, they wave at me, I assume they're waving at the person behind me, and totally ignore them. They have to speak to me in order for me to recognize them. So even my recall is actually quite poor. Even my recognition is actually quite poor. So what they did when they took that data and went through and outlined what I could and couldn't do and what I they made some really dire predictions. They told my mother that I would never learn to read or write, that my motor skills would improve very, very slowly with the process known as melanization. It's a developmental process of lining your nerve cells with insulated material that happens from birth to 18. And as that progressed, I'd get a little better, but all the practice or all the effort in the world wouldn't help at all with my motor skills. And didn't give her any hope that I would ever learn to either read or write. They took that hope away, that hope of that potential away from me to some degree from her. At least that should have been the effect that what they said had. The next part, though, was interesting. So, on an IQ test where I had scored as absolutely retarded on some of the sections of the test, and on at least one of them, I scored in the 10th percentile in the bottom. I still ended up with a global score of 127, which meant that on most sections of the test, I was scoring at genius levels. So that's was shocking that with such good news came such dire predictions. And my mother didn't accept this. She was terribly upset, distraught, but she had faith. Part of it was religious faith, but the source doesn't really matter. She had faith that things would be different. And I think my story, and I'd really like to illustrate that part of the story, shows, I guess, one of the morals of the story is what faith can do and what it can't do. And that's a really, the people, you have people like atheists, and I'm not bagging on atheists, pointing out the limitations of faith and perhaps, being a bit unfair about the role faith has in people's life, because faith is important. As you'll see, you don't have to believe in God, but you do have to believe in yourself. Nobody achieved anything great without having faith that the unlikely was still possible. The difficult was still achievable and attainable. So, I'm not bagging on atheism at all, but I would like to point out that faith is important whether or not there is a God. And that's, I think, something that they miss quite often. And the next thing, though, is too often, and it's not just regular religious stuff, it's things like The Secret that was all the rage a while back, which is just a rebranding of If You Wish Upon a Star bullcrap that you really should stay in Disney fairy tales and not be applied to real life. That takes that principle too far and does damage with it, particularly two people whose potential is very different than the norm, as mine certainly was. The results of the assessment were kind of the opposite of what my mother expected. She thought that knowing what the problem was would make solving it obvious, how to solve it. But instead, the problem looked more insoluble than ever. On the other hand, it was clear that I was very lucky. I don't know if you've known people with cerebral palsy, full-blown cerebral palsy, but I have a cousin who has it. She's in a wheelchair. She doesn't just have trouble with her small, moving her large muscles. She can't move them accurately over any distance. She visibly shakes. She's significantly mentally retarded. She's just a wonderful, wonderful person, and really fun to be around. But she is so much more disabled than I am, and every person I've ever met with cerebral palsy has been pretty much at that level of disability, and so I was really lucky that I could walk fine and that I could learn most things pretty well, and didn't have a lot of obvious limitations. So despite my mother's disappointment, looking back on it, I really was and am extremely lucky. I really, with how traumatic my birth was, survival with any ability beyond that is beyond being in a wheelchair, not even being able to hold my head up, and being able to feed myself and use the bathroom by myself is I was really lucky to escape that. So over time, and I was definitely not grateful for this going through school. In fact, I envied my niece quite a bit, because nobody had unrealistic expectations of her. But I wasn't always grateful for it, but I certainly have become very grateful. Looking back and seeing how close I was to being far worse off, that's for sure, than I was. Next time, we'll talk about my grade school years and how that went, and I'd just like to tell everyone, be grateful, because you can always find somebody who has it worse than you do, and have faith that you can achieve, at the very least, happiness and great things. And be reasonable and compassionate.